Hey everybody, and welcome back to the SV Lynx channel. And today we're going to continue our three-part series on building a lithium prototype battery that we will be using eventually into SV Lynx. And we have some other things as well, though, we're going to cover today.
While he's working on building the battery, I'm going to go into the office and work on sourcing our epoxy. As you recall, our shipment was delayed because the epoxy couldn't be in the container as it was considered hazardous material.
Yeah, and we do have some big news, and we will share that by the end of the video. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with all of you. And we're also going to do a few corrections from some other videos at the end and take a couple of questions. So let's get started on that. And Marianne's going to go in and do her work on getting that epoxy sorted. All right, well, to get started today on the batteries, the first thing we're going to have to do is drill a bunch of holes in these plates that we already cut on the saw last time. And so we got the drill press out, and we're going to line these up and get some holes drilled. There's a whole bunch on one side and about 8 holes on the other. So those are for the rods that put them under compression. And as soon as we get that done, we'll move over to the bench and start assembling these things. All right, well, the plates are all drilled, and so the next thing I have to do is prepare these rods and the springs that go on them for the compression, and then these little boxes here. I'll show you one. And what these do is they're inserted like so, and this allows the spring to compress from the inside, and I'll show you that when I hook that up. So I've got to get these all hooked up and then put through these plates, and we'll get to the battery here in a second and start assembling. I had to create these boxes and put the springs on the inside because once these are on here like this, the springs are in between the batteries and on the ends, and if they spring stuck out the other end, they wouldn't fit inside of the box. So this was the only way to fit them into the tight waterproof box that I want to put them in and keep them smaller. That meant that I also had to keep the nuts that are on the other side very small because it just isn't enough room in there. So this way, it solves all that problem. But that also meant that I had to have these springs to pull against. And although these look like they're plastic, these are 3D printed in onyx, but even that wouldn't be strong enough for the kind of pressure we're going to put these under to get these things to the right pressure. That's going to put, you know, over 100 pounds per spring here. And so that would be too much for plastic and it would break. But by using a Forged Mark II printer, which prints in onyx but also can put continuous carbon fiber into the build, I can strengthen these things up to the point where they can hold a lot, as in thousands of pounds of pressure rather than less than 100 here. So that makes these very strong and very rigid. And so that works, and I don't have to do some kind of custom manufacturing or something here. I can just model these up in the computer, print them out on the Mark II from Mark Forged, get that continuous fiber in there, and strengthen them up. In fact, we're going to be using that Mark II for printing quite a few different parts. It's very useful. I can print in just onyx if we want to save money and not put carbon fiber in when we don't need the strength. Now, you could buy their onyx model, and it would do that, and it'd be much less expensive. But if you want the continuous carbon fiber in there to get the super kind of strength that we want, then you have to go with their Mark II. And I've worked with Mark Forged because I worked with a good friend of mine who owns a 3D printer company, and he sells Mark Forged and other brands. And so because of that, and I worked with him for about 4 years, I have access to using some of these printers right now. And that allows me to print all kinds of different things for this battery build, But beyond that, for example, we're going to also be building a solar arch out of carbon fiber struts, but I need something to join those struts together, and it's very custom, so I'll just 3D print all the joints, and again, I can add carbon fiber into them to make them super strong. All right, so let's see where this goes. Now, you'll notice I've already got the rods in here and the springs already on, and that's because once they insert on, I could get to the ones on the outside, but I couldn't get to the ones in the center of the battery. So all of these things need to be already set and ready to go over here. Very snug fit. Just up to the right height. Now the trick will be to get all of these into these holes. All right, so at this point we need to measure the springs and then check my spreadsheet, and it'll tell us how much we need to compress this to put these under the right compression. So it gives you a per spring amount in that spreadsheet. So we'll go check that, and then I'll come back and tighten these up and get this snugged up to just the right amount of pressure. As you can see, we don't stick out much here, and the springs compress there. There you have it. Works. All right, so now that we've got these all squashed, compressed in here, we've got a nice little brick of the battery. So next thing that we're going to do is start working on the electronics. And we've already sort of started. And we already made all 6 for the batteries. And what these do is this is going to mount right here at the end. And this is going to hold our BMS and our circuit breaker and our various switches for turning on the BMS and pre-charging the unit. So this battery comes in 3 parts, sort of. This piece here gets lowered into the box by itself. Then this one has all the electronics on it, and it will slot into holders like so down into the box, and then all we have to do is hook up the terminals to this over here. And then the third piece is the box itself, which has electronics mounted to it as well, and we'll show you that in a bit. But for now, let's go ahead and start putting the electronics that go on the second piece, this insert right here. All right, so I've drilled some holes like I talked about here for the various pieces that go in here. And now I'm going to mount some special 3D printed parts that we did to hold the JK BMS. And these are just little brackets, and they're custom made to fit the BMS. So a little nice for being custom like that. So we just snug those down. The printer even beveled the holes for us. So makes it pretty easy. Nice part about 3D printing is you can make anything, any shape, anything you want. All you do is go to your computer, model up exactly what you want. It's so accurate that it's down to incredibly precise of fitting everything. So then it just, you have to wait. It does take a little time to print, but if you're trying to make custom pieces, it's incredibly useful. So, for example, there's our mount for the BMS, and we just 3D printed all that stuff. So let's see. Here's one of the JK BMS modules that we're using. And it's just going to slot in here, like so. And then these are snaps, so it'll snap like so, and that's not going anywhere at this point. So as you can see, it's now mounted. And these are really strong because there's carbon fiber strands in these, so they're not going to break as they snapped on like that. So a perfect, snug, tight fit. It's in there perfectly. And so that will mount over here. And we'll start hooking up those leads in a bit. So the next thing we need to mount on here is the circuit breaker. So let me go get that. So this is our circuit breaker. It's a 200 amp circuit breaker from Bussmann. And so we didn't go with the less expensive, cheap Chinese versions. We went with a quality, well-reviewed one. And that fits right here. We've already marked the holes, so I just need to screw that down in there, and we'll be set and ready to go with that one as well. So let me get to that one in a moment here. After that, we'll put this 9-volt battery holder on here, which goes about there. The point of this circuit breaker is so that we can shut down the battery if we're working on it from inside by just flipping the switch right here. But it's also a circuit breaker, so if there's some kind of overload and such, it'll blow that circuit and stop things from going haywire on us as well. All right, 2 of the electronics mounted. Now if you'll notice, this one's really high up, and that's because when the case comes to about here, we can get to this switch without digging down inside the case. So when the lid's up, this is exposed. Okay, the next piece up is this 9-volt battery holder, and this is for activating this JKBMS. The JKBMS is a little odd in that how it gets started. You have to short, basically, these 2 P- and B- leads here, putting at least 5 volts across them. And so a 9-volt battery does the job. What happens is this is mounted here, and once you put the battery in, you push a button, it activates the BMS, and then you take this battery out. It doesn't stay in the thing and go bad on you. If you ever need to work on this and replace one of these cells or something, then you just pop a 9-volt battery into here when you're done, push the button, and it activates the BMS. So we don't have to hold batteries up to leads and anything like that. We just stick a battery in, push a button, fires it up. So it's just a little nicer. So we'll get that mounted next.
While Phil works on some of the tedious parts of mounting electronics to the board, I'll bring you up to speed on a few things to do with our kit. Since the shipping companies suddenly won't let epoxy into the container, even though this has never happened to Schionning Designs before our shipment, we've been trying to source the epoxy locally. Schionning has given us 3 options. The first is to purchase the same epoxy they were shipping, which is from Cyclamen. The second option is to buy ProSet for laminated areas, which is a different brand. We would couple that with the West Systems epoxy for other areas. It's not quite a half and half split. The third option is for Schionning to send the Cyclamen epoxy they have in a separate shipment. There are issues with all 3. For option number 1, the only Cyclamen dealer in the U.S. is on the East Coast, and we're building our CAT in Southern California. That means nearly $2,000 in shipping costs, and that is added to the higher price of $25,000 for the epoxy and hardener. That's $27,000 total, and we would have to order it all together, and that means we would need a climate-controlled location to store all those drums, since they cannot go above 90 degrees, and we have weeks of over 106 degrees during Southern California summers. Option number 2 is to buy ProSet and West Systems epoxy locally. That is attractive, since the local vendor will store the epoxy and just give it to us as we need in smaller buckets. The issue here is that the cost of the ProSet portion is $22,000, and we still need to purchase the West Systems, which is another $8,000, making the total cost $30,000. Option number 3 is to ship Cyclamen epoxy from South Africa. The good news is that the epoxy only costs $18,000, but we must pay import duties, taxes, shipping agents, and other fees, etc. Most likely, that would be in the range of $5,000 total, so $23,000. It's still less expensive than either of the other 2 options. However, we've come up with a 4th option. We're asking for a quote of just the Cyclamen we need for lamination from South Africa, and we'll buy the West Systems locally. If that's the case, we might get the Sycamore portion for $13,000 and the West Systems epoxy for $8,000, which brings us to $21,000. That would still be $3,000 more than our original cost in the kit, but it's less expensive than all the other options. As of a moment ago, when I messaged Robert, we're now waiting on a quote for that option. The only good thing in all this is that the shipping costs dropped from $9,000 to $5,500 in the change of ships, so we saved $3,500. That could offset the extra cost of the epoxy if we go with our fourth option. Well, nothing more to do on that today. We'll have to wait on the quote from Sycamore before we make a choice. Let's get back to Phil and the work on our Prototype Lithium batteries.
And if we had a 9-volt battery, which we do, we can plug this in right here and see how that works. There we go. We have our 9-volt battery mounted there. And we'll wire this up in a bit. Okay, so what else do we need on here? Just a couple things. There's a terminal here and a couple of buttons. Now we have our resistor over here. That'll get hooked up to this button right here. So let's do that next. So we use yellow for this one and blue for this one. So what you get here is this button pre-charges the downstream things like your capacitors and your inverters. So before you flip this switch on, send all this power through and surging through all those capacitors, you just push this button. It's going to put a trickle of power through. It'll fill up those capacitors. That way when you hit this, you don't have any surges going on. Now most modern inverters are probably protected against anything like that. But you know, it just doesn't hurt to be sure. So before you activate this big battery, you just push this button for a couple of seconds. It puts that trickle charge out down there, downstream, and flip it on. Away you go. And here, again, if you need to activate the BMS, put a battery in, push the button. When you're all done, take this battery out, and you can snap it back in later if you ever need it. The last thing we're going to put on is this terminal right here. What this is for is we're going to be putting these two together into a single lug, and that lug will go onto this post right here. And then another lug will come up from this and extend this, go around this corner right here, and back and connect to the negative on the battery, which is over here somewhere. All right, well, that concludes our second episode on building our prototype battery. We've got the battery under compression, and we've got the electronics mounted on the HDPE board, and that's going to be inserted into the case after the battery goes about right there. And let me cover these terminals up here for a second. I can take off my glasses while we talk.
Hey Phil, we just got some good news.
And what's that? Robert
from Schionning has been spending the last 10 hours getting our container loaded on the ship, ready to come.
Thank heavens, finally. If you recall, that was delayed by 2 months due to the epoxy that Marianne's been working on today. But this is the big news that we mentioned at the beginning. They managed to get a better transfer in Shanghai, China, and it cuts off an entire month on us getting our kit. And so instead of April, we're going to get it March 4th. And so that's big news for us. And the videos for the building of our cat will then begin a month sooner. So I'm excited about that. Now, I do want to go over a couple of corrections from some previous videos because we want to be accurate. And sometimes when we're just talking off the top of our heads here and trying to do math in our heads, you know, I make a mistake once in a while, you know, we're human. And we don't want to give any false information out or any mistakes. So occasionally we'll make a correction in a video about previous videos. So we're going to go do that in the office right now. So let's head on in there. It's time to make a few corrections to our past videos. Occasionally we make a mistake in something we say. This is often due to talking to the camera live. Sometimes we're doing math in our heads and mess up, or we use the incorrect term for something that just doesn't come to us, even though we may know the real answer. Sometimes things just change. Here are a few corrections from previous videos. In our video about the electric convertible dinghy, we talked about using the Spirit 1.0 Evo for hydrogeneration. That's on the main CAD. It turns out that ePropulsion had their own small error in their website. Like us, they made a mistake. They stated that they recommend you use their battery for hydrogeneration, when what they meant to say is that they require that you use their battery. One of our viewers alerted us to this error, and we read the manual, where it does state that you need to use ePropulsion's external battery. I contacted the company, and they apologized and promised to fix their website. So, here's the good news. The Spirit 1.0 can run off any external 48-volt battery. So that means our primary usages for the outboard are still valid. It will also act as our waterproof outboard going through small surf to shore, and as our backup outboard for when we're going a long distance away from the catamaran. We can still use it in hydrogeneration mode to charge their own battery as well. Next up, in our Year 1 projected route video, we were talking about the Gambier and Austral Islands and mentioned we would be there in summer when we really should have said winter. That was just a slip up. Now, having looked at all that again, we discovered that October seems to be a good month to be there, so we did rearrange things a bit in the video. We now go straight through the Tuamotus atolls to the Society Islands, where we spend 3 months, then return to the Tuamotus and begin a clockwise loop that takes us to the Gambier and Austral chains in October. Then we pass back through the Society Islands at Papeete and continue on to the Tuamotus atolls again, so that we can put SV Lynx on the hard while we fly back to the US. Now, in part 1 of our battery prototype video from last week, a viewer pointed out that we said watts per hour when we should have said watt hours. He's right, so we'll try not to slip up again in the future. We knew better, but it just came out that way while we were talking. And the same viewer pointed out that we were wrong about the amount of power consumption at various speeds. This was also just a math slip-up in trying to do it live. In fact, it would have been better to just state it this way. For a displacement boat making way through water, the required propulsive power increases proportional to the cube of the speed. This means that if you want to double your speed, you need 8 times as much power. That also means that if you cut your speed in half, you're burning power at 1/8 the rate. That extends your range significantly, which was the entire point of that part of the video. Okay, that's enough for today. If you do see or hear us saying something you think is wrong, please post in the comments about that issue, and if you're right, we'll add another correction segment to a future video, so that we aren't telling people incorrect information, at least not permanently. Now, I'm going to take a couple of questions from viewers of the last 2 videos. Sailing Someday asked, do you have to worry about the discharge rate of the cells? Absolutely. Each of our batteries is capable of a 1C discharge rate, which means we could pull 230 amps from each, but we won't. Our goal is to never pull more than 0.5 C, and we'll be setting our JK BMSs to only allow us to pull that much from each battery. But that should be plenty for our needs, including when we're using electric propulsion. But we must wait for sea trials to get all the real numbers. If after sea trials we feel that we're pulling too much or don't have enough at 0.5 C, we'll add more batteries as necessary. However, on paper, everything looks good, so we'll test before adding the weight and cost of additional lithium batteries. Now, Morgan Anderson asked, are you considering some sort of anti-fouling solution other than just bottom paint for the hulls? Yes, we're looking into all the anti-foul options. We would prefer to go with something that is not, or at least is less damaging to the environment, if it works to a decent degree. One such option is to go with silicone anti-foul. In that case, the silicone is so slippery that if we get up to a decent speed, like above 8 knots, the motion of the water will clean the hulls, saving us from scrubbing them all the time. And since we are a performance cat, getting above 8 knots will be a piece of cake. However, the issue with silicone is that it's not very resistant to rubbing off with contact. since we plan to beach SV Lynx at times, that's an issue. So the hunt continues. Suggestions from boaters who have tested their option around the world are very welcome. So let us know what you found out. All right, well, that concludes our questions for now, and we'll move on to the end of the video. All right, well, that's a wrap for this week's video. And next week we'll do the final part 3 of our lithium prototype battery build.
Don't forget to like and subscribe and click on the bell icon.
And we'd also like to thank our patrons. The newest ones and the existing loyal patrons are down here on the left. And we would also just like to thank all of you for watching. So we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.